She had nothing left but a cracked pot and a dying fire. But when Eliza Rowe cooked her last meal in a forgotten frontier square, she didn't know that one stranger's kindness would lead her to a mountain ranch where the coldest man in Wyoming territory would test her like no one ever had. When flames erupted and the ranch owner froze in terror, Eliza had to choose. Run from the fire that could kill her, or face it to save the man who had given her one brutal chance. This is the story of a woman who lost everything, earned her worth in ashes, and found a home she never thought she deserved. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop a comment with your city below. I want to see how far Eliza's story travels. Hit that like button and settle in, because this is a journey you won't want to miss. The wind carried dust like a punishment. Eliza Rowe knelt in the center of Bitter Creek's forgotten town square, her skirt pooling in the dirt, her hands steady despite the tremor that lived somewhere deeper than her bones. The fire she'd built was small, barely more than a whisper of flame beneath a cracked iron pot, but it was hers, the only thing left that was. Around her, the square sat empty. Bitter Creek wasn't much of a town anymore. Half the storefronts stood boarded up, their paint peeling like old skin. The saloon still operated, its doors swinging open now and then to release a gust of stale tobacco and laughter that felt too loud for a dying place. A few townspeople passed by, their eyes sliding over Eliza like she was part of the landscape. Another piece of debris the wind had blown in and would eventually blow away. She didn't blame them. She stirred the pot with a wooden spoon worn smooth by years of use. Inside, a thin stew bubbled, potatoes she'd scrounged from behind the general store, a handful of wild onions, a scrap of salt pork the butcher had given her out of pity or disgust. She couldn't tell which. The smell rose into the cold autumn air, and for a moment, Eliza closed her eyes and let herself remember when cooking had meant something other than survival. There had been a house once, a husband, a life that felt solid beneath her feet. Then the creditors came. They'd come like locusts, she thought. Polite at first, with their leather satchels and carefully worded letters. Her husband, Thomas, had owed money, more than Eliza had known, more than they could ever repay. He'd borrowed against the farm, against tools they didn't own, against a future he'd convinced himself was coming. And when the fever took him that bitter winter, it left Eliza alone with debts that swallowed everything. The house went first, then the livestock, then the furniture, the clothes, the wedding ring Thomas had made from a bent silver spoon. By the time the creditors were finished, Eliza had nothing but the dress on her back, the cracked pot, a burned skillet, and the wooden spoon she now held. She opened her eyes and stirred the stew. A woman with nothing. That's what she'd become. But she could still cook. And if she could cook, she could eat. And if she could eat, she could survive one more day. That was as far as her thinking went now. One day, then another, a long string of days that didn't add up to a future, just a slow march toward whatever end was waiting. The stew thickened. Eliza pulled the pot from the fire and set it on a flat stone to cool. She had no bowl, so she'd eat straight from the pot with her spoon, the way she had for weeks now. It wasn't dignified, it wasn't decent, but dignity was another thing the creditors had taken, and decency didn't fill an empty stomach. She was raising the first spoonful to her lips when a shadow fell across the fire. Eliza looked up. An old man stood there, leaning heavily on a gnarled walking stick. His face was a map of deep lines, his beard more salt than pepper, his eyes the color of faded denim. He wore a dusty coat and a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better decades. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, looking down at her with an expression she couldn't read. Eliza lowered the spoon. "Can I help you?" The old man's gaze shifted to the pot. "That smells better than anything I've had in a month." She hesitated. The stew was meant to last her 2 days, maybe 3 if she stretched it. But the old man looked hungry in a way that went deeper than his stomach, and Eliza had never been able to turn away from hunger, not even when she carried it herself. "I don't have much," she said quietly, "but you're welcome to share." The old man's eyes crinkled at the corners. "That's kind of you, miss." He lowered himself to the ground with a grunt, settling across from her with the fire between them. Eliza pulled the burned skillet from her pack and spooned half the stew into it, then handed it across. The old man took it with both hands, nodding his thanks. They ate in silence for a while. The wind pushed dust across the square. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of rust and amber. Finally, the old man spoke. "You're not from Bitter Creek." "No." "Passing through?" Eliza looked into the pot, at the few potatoes still floating in the thin broth. "I don't know where I'm going, so I suppose I'm passing through everywhere." The old man studied her for a long moment. "You got people?" "Not anymore." He nodded slowly, like that was an answer he understood. "You got work?" Eliza shook her head. "I've tried. Most places won't hire a woman alone. They think I'll cause trouble or run off, or—" She stopped herself. There was no point in listing all the reasons the world had decided she wasn't worth the risk. The old man finished his portion and set the skillet down. "You cook like this often. Every day. It's all I know how to do." "You do it well." Eliza met his eyes, surprised by the sincerity there. "Thank you." The old man leaned back, his gaze drifting toward the mountains that rose like dark teeth on the horizon. "There's a ranch up in those hills, about a day's walk north of here, maybe a little more. Belongs to a man named Caleb Hart." The name meant nothing to Eliza, but she listened. "Caleb's a hard man," the old man continued. "Lost his wife some years back. Fire took her. Since then, he's kept to himself, runs his ranch with a handful of men who don't much like him but respect him enough to stay. He doesn't tolerate weakness, doesn't tolerate excuses, but he's fair in his way, and he needs someone who can cook." Eliza's pulse quickened despite herself. "He's hiring." "Didn't say that." The old man's eyes shifted back to her. "But he might give you a chance if you ask. Might not too. Caleb doesn't care much for strangers, and he cares even less for people who can't pull their weight. If you go up there, you'd better be ready to prove yourself." "I've been proving myself my whole life," Eliza said quietly. The old man smiled, a slow curve beneath his weathered beard. "I believe you have." He pushed himself to his feet with the help of his walking stick, wincing as his knees protested. "The ranch is called Ironwood. You follow the north road till it forks, then take the western trail into the hills. You'll see the ranch marker, a post with a horseshoe nailed to it. Can't miss it." Eliza stood as well, her heart pounding now. "Why are you telling me this?" The old man looked at her for a long moment, something soft and sad moving behind his eyes. "Because I've been where you are, miss, and someone once gave me a chance when I had nothing. Maybe it's time I passed that along." He tipped his hat to her, then turned and walked away, his stick tapping against the hard-packed earth. Eliza watched him go, her mind spinning. A ranch. A man who might hire her. A chance. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd had an hour ago. Eliza left Bitter Creek before dawn. She packed what little she had, the pot, the skillet, the spoon, a thin blanket, and the last of the stew wrapped in a cloth. The road north was little more than a pair of wagon ruts cutting through sagebrush and stone, and the wind bit at her face as she walked. The sun rose slowly, spilling gold across the empty land. Eliza kept her eyes on the mountains ahead, their peaks capped with early snow. She thought about the old man's words. Caleb's a hard man, doesn't tolerate weakness. She wondered what kind of hardness lived in a man who'd lost his wife to fire. Wondered if it was the kind that made you cruel or the kind that made you careful. Wondered if it mattered. By midday, her feet ached and her stomach growled. She stopped to rest in the shade of a scrub pine, chewing on a piece of dried bread she'd saved. The land stretched out around her, vast and indifferent. No towns, no farms, just rock and dust and sky. She thought about turning back, but there was nothing to turn back to. So she stood, shouldered her pack, and kept walking. The fork in the road came late in the afternoon. Eliza took the western trail as the old man had instructed, and the path began to climb. The air grew colder. Her breath misted in front of her face. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and pushed on. Night was falling when she finally saw it. A wooden post driven into the ground at the edge of a narrow valley. A rusted horseshoe hung from a nail at the top, swaying slightly in the wind. Ironwood. Eliza stopped, her heart thudding hard against her ribs. Below, she could make out the shapes of buildings. A large ranch house, a barn, a few smaller structures scattered across the valley floor. Smoke rose from a chimney, gray against the darkening sky. Lantern light flickered in one of the windows. She stood there for a long time, staring down at the ranch. Then she took a breath and started walking again. By the time Eliza reached the ranch house, full dark had settled over the valley. Her legs trembled with exhaustion, and her hands were numb despite the blanket. She stood in the yard, looking up at the solid timber structure. It was well built. She could see that even in the dim light, tight corners, a strong roof, windows that fit their frames. A place made to last. The front door opened before she could knock. A man stepped out onto the porch, lantern in hand. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a beard that covered the lower half of his face. His eyes were hard to read in the lantern light, but his posture said everything, wary, guarded, ready to send her away. "You lost?" His voice was rough, like gravel dragged over stone. Eliza straightened her spine. "No. I'm looking for Caleb Hart." "You found him." He lifted the lantern slightly, studying her. "What do you want?" "Work." Caleb's expression didn't change. "I'm not hiring." "I can cook," Eliza said quickly. "I can clean, mend, manage a household. I don't need much, just food and a place to sleep." "I said I'm not hiring." Caleb started to turn back toward the door. "Please." The word came out sharper than she'd intended, and it stopped him. He looked back at her, his eyes narrowing. Eliza swallowed hard. "I walked all day to get here. I have nowhere else to go. I'm asking for a chance to prove I'm worth keeping. That's all." Caleb studied her for a long moment. She could feel his gaze taking in every detail, the dirt on her dress, the worn blanket, the hollow look she knew lived in her face. She waited for him to dismiss her, to tell her to leave and not come back. Instead, he said, "You ever work a ranch before?" "No." "You know anything about cattle? Horses?" "No." "Then what makes you think you can be useful here?" Eliza met his eyes. "Because I've survived when I shouldn't have. Because I know how to work until there's nothing left in me, and then keep working. Because I don't quit." Caleb's jaw tightened. For a moment, she thought she saw something flicker behind his eyes, something that might have been recognition, or memory, or pain, but it was gone before she could be sure. He exhaled slowly, a cloud of mist in the cold air. 7 days. Eliza blinked. "What?" "I'll give you 7 days to prove you're worth keeping. You cook for me and my men. You keep the house clean. You do what needs doing without complaint. At the end of 7 days, I decide if you stay or go." He stepped closer, the lantern light casting harsh shadows across his face. "But understand this. I don't give second chances. You mess up, you're done. You slack off, you're done. You cause trouble, you're done. Clear?" Eliza's throat tightened. "Clear." "Good." Caleb gestured toward the house. "There's a room off the kitchen. You can sleep there. I expect breakfast ready before sunrise. My men eat at dawn." He turned and walked back inside, leaving the door open behind him. Eliza stood in the yard for a moment, her legs shaking with something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite fear. Then she picked up her pack and followed him into the house. The kitchen was larger than she'd expected, with a wide stone hearth, a sturdy work table, and shelves lined with jars and tins. A black iron stove sat against one wall, its surface still warm from the evening meal. Caleb led her to a narrow door beside the pantry and pushed it open. The room beyond was small, barely large enough for a cot and a chest, but it was clean, and there was a window that looked out over the valley. "This is yours," Caleb said. "There's a well out back, an outhouse past the barn. You need anything else, you figure it out yourself." Eliza set her pack on the cot. "Thank you." Caleb didn't answer. He was already walking away, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. She heard him climb the stairs, heard a door close somewhere above. She was alone. Eliza sat on the cot and let out a long, shaky breath. Her hands were trembling now, the exhaustion catching up all at once. She wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. They hadn't come in months. Maybe she'd used them all up already. She lay down on the cot, pulling the thin blanket over herself. Through the window, she could see stars scattered across the black sky like salt spilled on stone. 7 days. She closed her eyes and let the darkness take her. Eliza woke before dawn, her body trained by months of sleeping rough to wake at the first hint of light. She sat up, disoriented for a moment before remembering where she was. Ironwood Ranch, Caleb Hart, 7 days. She rose quickly, splashing cold water on her face from the basin in the kitchen. The house was silent, but she could hear movement outside, boots on gravel, the low murmur of men's voices. The ranch hands were already stirring. Eliza moved to the stove and got to work. She built the fire first, coaxing the embers back to life with kindling and patience. While the stove heated, she explored the pantry, taking stock of what was available. Flour, salt, lard, dried beans, a slab of bacon, eggs in a wire basket. Enough to make a decent breakfast if she was careful. She mixed biscuit dough, her hands working the flour and lard together with the ease of long practice. While the biscuits baked, she fried thick slices of bacon and scrambled eggs in the hot grease. She made coffee strong enough to wake the dead, the way her mother had taught her. By the time the sun broke over the mountains, the kitchen smelled like heaven. The door opened and men filed in. There were 5 of them, all weathered and worn in the way of men who spent their lives outside. They moved to the long table without speaking, their eyes flicking toward Eliza with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. She kept her head down, setting plates and cups in front of them. Caleb came in last. He took the seat at the head of the table, his gaze moving over the food she'd laid out. He didn't say anything, just picked up his fork and started eating. The men followed his lead. Eliza stood by the stove, watching. She'd learned long ago that the first meal set the tone. If the food was good, you earned a measure of respect. If it was bad, you were done before you started. One of the men, a lean grain man with a scar across his cheek, bit into a biscuit. He chewed slowly, then nodded. "Damn, that's good." Another man grunted in agreement. "Better than the slop we've been eating." Eliza allowed herself a small breath of relief. Caleb said nothing. He ate methodically, his face unreadable. When he finished, he stood, pushed his chair back, and looked at her for the first time since entering the room. "Noon meal at 12, supper at 6. Don't be late." Then he walked out, and the men followed. Eliza was left alone in the kitchen, staring at the empty plates. She'd passed the first test. 6 more days to go. Boom. The days blurred together in a rhythm of work. Eliza rose before dawn, built the fire, cooked breakfast. She cleaned the kitchen, scrubbed the floors, mended shirts and socks by lantern light. At noon, she prepared a meal for the men, stew or beans or whatever she could make stretch. At 6, she cooked supper, often something more substantial. Roasted meat, cornbread, vegetables from the root cellar. Caleb spoke to her only when necessary, his words clipped and efficient. The ranch hands were friendlier, though cautious. They thanked her for the food, complimented her cooking, but kept their distance. She was still an outsider, still on trial. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, the sound of cattle lowing in the distance, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the sharp crack of a whip as one of the men drove a team of horses. She learned which men liked their coffee black and which took it with sugar. Learned that Caleb ate little and spoke less, his silence heavy and deliberate. On the 4th day, she saw him standing by the barn, staring up at the hayloft with an expression that made her chest tighten. He stood there for a long time, not moving, his hands clenched at his sides. She didn't ask what he was looking at. On the 5th day, one of the ranch hands, a young man named Tommy, cut his hand badly on a piece of barbed wire. Eliza cleaned and bandaged the wound, her hands steady, even as Tommy cursed and flinched. Caleb watched from the doorway, his face unreadable. "You know how to do that?" he asked after Tommy left. "I've done it before," Eliza said simply. Caleb nodded once and walked away. On the 6th day, she overheard 2 of the men talking in the yard. "Think he'll keep her?" "Don't know. She's good at what she does, but you know how he is. Doesn't trust easy. She's been here almost a week and hasn't caused trouble. That's more than most can say." "Maybe. We'll see." Eliza went back to kneading bread dough, her jaw tight. 7 days. Tomorrow would be the 7th day, and she still had no idea if Caleb Hart would let her stay. The storm came on the 7th night. Eliza had just finished cleaning up after supper when she heard the wind pick up, rattling the windows in their frames. She stepped outside to check the sky and saw dark clouds roiling over the mountains, lightning flickering in their bellies. The air smelled like rain and electricity. She went back inside, but the unease lingered. She'd seen storms on the frontier before, how fast they could turn, how violent they could become. She banked the fire in the stove, checked the windows, and went to her small room. She was just lying down when she heard the shout. "Fire! Fire in the barn!" Eliza's heart stopped. She bolted upright, threw open her door, and ran. Outside, chaos had erupted. The hay barn was engulfed in flames, the fire roaring like a living thing. Smoke billowed into the night sky, and the heat was so intense she could feel it from 20 yards away. The horses in the nearby corral screamed and kicked at the fence, terrified. The ranch hands stood frozen, their faces pale in the firelight, and Caleb stood at the edge of the flames, staring into the inferno. His face was white. His hands shook. He didn't move. Eliza's mind raced. The barn was full of hay. If the fire spread to the main barn, they'd lose the horses. If it reached the house, she ran toward the men. "We need water, buckets, barrels, anything." They stared at her. "Now!" she screamed. That broke the spell. The men scattered, running for the well for the water troughs. Eliza grabbed a bucket and filled it, then ran toward the barn. The heat hit her like a fist, but she threw the water at the base of the flames and ran back for more, again and again. The men joined her, forming a ragged line. They threw water, beat at the flames with wet blankets, shouted to each other over the roar of the fire. But Caleb still didn't move. Eliza ran to him, grabbed his arm. "Caleb, we need you." He didn't respond. His eyes were locked on the flames, wide and unseeing. She shook him. "Caleb!" Nothing. She looked back at the fire. It was spreading toward the main barn now, the flames licking at the wooden walls. They were running out of time. Eliza made a decision. She turned to the men. "Tommy, get the horses out of the corral. Move them to the far pasture. The rest of you, focus on the main barn. Don't let the fire reach it." The men hesitated, looking toward Caleb. "Do it!" Eliza shouted. They moved. Eliza ran back to the well, her lungs burning, her hands raw. She filled bucket after bucket, threw water until her arms screamed with exhaustion. The heat seared her face, singed her hair. She didn't stop. The fire fought back, but slowly, so slowly, they began to win. The flames in the hay barn burned themselves out, collapsing inward with a groan of timber. The main barn was scorched but standing, the fire beaten back before it could take hold. Eliza dropped the bucket and fell to her knees, gasping for air. Around her, the men did the same, their faces black with soot, their clothes soaked and steaming. The storm finally broke, rain pouring down in cold, heavy sheets. Eliza looked up and saw Caleb still standing where she'd left him, rain streaming down his face, his eyes still fixed on the ruins of the hay barn. She pushed herself to her feet and walked to him. "Caleb." He didn't answer. She stepped in front of him, blocking his view of the fire. "Caleb, it's over." His eyes finally focused on her. For a moment, she saw something terrible in them, grief so deep it had no bottom. Then he turned and walked away into the rain, leaving her standing alone. Eliza didn't sleep that night. She sat in the kitchen, wrapped in a blanket, watching the rain streak down the windows. Her hands were blistered, her face burned, her body trembling with exhaustion, but her mind wouldn't stop. She thought about Caleb's face in the firelight, the way he'd frozen, the terror in his eyes, lost his wife some years back. Fire took her. She understood now. And she understood something else, too. Caleb Hart was broken in a way that had nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with pain. He'd built walls around himself so high and so thick that nothing could get in. Not kindness, not hope, not help. But walls like that didn't keep you safe. They just kept you alone. The door opened and Caleb stepped inside. He was soaked, his hair plastered to his head, his clothes dripping onto the floor. He didn't look at her, just walked to the stove and stood there, staring at nothing. Eliza rose slowly. "I'll make coffee." "Don't," she stopped. Caleb's hands gripped the edge of the stove, his knuckles white. "I froze out there." Eliza said nothing. "I saw the flames, and His voice cracked. "I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I just stood there like a damn coward while you and the men saved my ranch." "You're not a coward," Eliza said quietly. "Then what am I?" He turned to face her, his eyes red-rimmed. "What kind of man can't protect his own land? Can't even move when everything's burning down around him?" Eliza held his gaze. A man who's been hurt. A man who's scared. That doesn't make you a coward. It makes you human. Caleb shook his head, but he didn't argue. Eliza took a step closer. Your wife. She died in a fire. He flinched like she'd struck him. I'm sorry, she said. I can't imagine what that was like. But Caleb, you're still here, and your ranch is still standing, not because of me, because you gave me a chance, because you built something strong enough to survive. It almost didn't, but it did. She reached out, then stopped herself. You did. Caleb stared at her for a long moment, something raw and uncertain moving across his face. Then he looked away. 7 days are up. Eliza's heart clenched. You can stay, he said quietly. If you want. Relief flooded through her, so strong her knees almost buckled. I want to. Caleb nodded once. Good. Because He stopped, his jaw working. I don't think I can do this alone anymore. Eliza understood what it cost him to say that, understood the weight of the admission. You don't have to, she said. For the first time since she'd met him, Caleb Hart's face softened, and in the ruins of the worst night either of them had faced, something new began to take root, something that looked almost like hope. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the valley washed clean and gleaming under a pale sun. Eliza stood in the yard, surveying the damage in daylight. The hay barn was nothing but charred timber and ash, smoke still rising in thin wisps from the rubble. The main barn had survived, though its western wall was scorched black. The horses grazed peacefully in the far pasture, oblivious to how close they'd come to panic and injury. She rolled her shoulders, wincing at the stiffness. Her hands were wrapped in clean cloth, bandages she'd applied herself after Caleb had gone upstairs without another word. The blisters would heal. Everything else felt less certain. The men emerged from the bunkhouse slowly, moving like they'd aged a decade overnight. Tommy saw her first and nodded, his young face drawn with exhaustion. The others followed, gathering near the remains of the hay barn with the heaviness of men assessing a battlefield. Caleb came out last, his expression unreadable in the morning light. He walked past Eliza without speaking, joined his men at the barn, and stood there for a long moment before he finally spoke. We'll clear the debris today. Salvage what we can. I want the main barn reinforced by week's end. His voice was steady, controlled. Nothing in it suggested the brokenness Eliza had witnessed the night before. The men nodded and got to work. Eliza went back inside to start breakfast. She moved through the familiar motions, stoking the fire, mixing batter, frying bacon, but her mind was elsewhere. She kept seeing Caleb's face in the firelight, the way he'd frozen, the terrible emptiness in his eyes. She kept hearing his voice in the darkness. I don't think I can do this alone anymore. He'd let her stay. That was something. But she understood now that staying meant more than cooking and cleaning. It meant existing in a house haunted by grief, working for a man who carried his pain like a second skeleton beneath his skin. She wondered if she had the strength for it. Then she remembered she didn't have a choice. The men came in for breakfast, their boots leaving muddy tracks across the floor Eliza had scrubbed the day before. She didn't comment, just set plates in front of them and poured coffee. Caleb ate in silence, his gaze fixed somewhere past the window. When he finished, he stood without a word and walked back outside. The graying man with the scar, she'd learned his name was Frank, watched him go, then looked at Eliza. You did good last night, he said quietly. Real good. Eliza met his eyes. I just did what needed doing. So did he, once upon a time. Frank stood, collecting his plate. Before the fire that took Sarah. His wife. Frank nodded. Finest woman this valley ever saw. Smart, kind, didn't take any nonsense from anyone, including Caleb. She softened his edges, made him laugh. Made this place feel like a home instead of just a ranch. He paused at the door. When she died, something in him died too. He's been running this place on stubbornness and routine ever since. Last night was the first time I've seen him face a fire since then. He didn't face it, Eliza said. He froze. But he didn't run. Frank's eyes held something that might have been hope. That's more than he's done in 3 years. He left, and Eliza stood alone in the kitchen, Frank's words settling over her like dust. She cleaned up the breakfast dishes, swept the floor, then went outside to see if there was anything else she could do. The men were hauling charred beams from the hay barn, their faces grim with effort. Caleb worked alongside them, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cool air. Eliza walked to the well and filled a bucket with fresh water. She brought it to the men with a ladle, and they drank gratefully, nodding their thanks. When she offered the ladle to Caleb, he took it without meeting her eyes. "Thank you," he said, so quiet she almost didn't hear it. She nodded and walked back to the house. The days that followed fell into a new pattern. Eliza cooked, cleaned, tended to the small things that kept a household running. But now there was something else, a wariness in the air, a sense that everyone was waiting for something to shift or break. Caleb remained distant, speaking only when necessary, his silence more pronounced than before. But Eliza noticed small changes. He no longer avoided the kitchen when she was working. Sometimes he'd come in for coffee between tasks, standing by the stove without speaking, just present. Other times she'd catch him watching her from across the yard, his expression thoughtful in a way she couldn't decipher. The men, on the other hand, warmed to her steadily. Tommy started lingering after meals to help with dishes, chattering about his family back east. Frank brought her a jar of honey from town, claiming he'd bought too much and didn't want it to waste. Even the quiet ones, Miguel, who spoke little English, and Garrett, who spoke little at all, began to acknowledge her with small gestures of respect. It was Frank who finally broke the careful silence about what had happened. They were sitting on the porch one evening, Eliza mending a shirt while Frank smoked his pipe. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. "You probably heard about Sarah," Frank said, his voice casual but careful. Eliza's needle paused. "A little." "She was something." Frank exhaled a stream of smoke. "Met Caleb when he was just getting this place started. Most women would have taken one look at this hard land and run the other way, but not Sarah. She saw what it could be. Helped him build it from nothing." Eliza resumed her stitching. "How did the fire start?" Frank was quiet for a moment. Lantern got knocked over in the barn. It was winter. Everything was dry. The fire spread faster than anyone expected. Sarah was in the loft getting extra blankets for the horses. We'd had a cold snap, and she worried about them. His voice roughened. Caleb tried to get to her. We all did. But the smoke was too thick, the flames too hot. We heard her calling for help, and then... He stopped. Then we didn't. Eliza's hands stilled. How long ago? 3 years this December. 3 years. And Caleb still couldn't face fire without freezing. He blamed himself, Frank continued. Still does. Says he should have been faster, should have gotten to her, should have never let her go up there in the first place. Never mind that Sarah made her own choices, that she'd have torn into him for trying to stop her. He tapped ash from his pipe. Grief makes a man stupid sometimes. Makes him forget that some things are just accidents, not failures. Eliza thought about Thomas, about the creditors, about all the ways she'd blamed herself for not seeing the debts, not asking the right questions, not being enough to save what they'd built together. Yes, she said softly. It does. Frank glanced at her, something knowing in his eyes. You've carried your own weight, haven't you? We all have. He nodded and returned his gaze to the mountains. They sat in comfortable silence until the stars began to appear, scattered like sparks across the darkening sky. Inside, Eliza heard Caleb moving around in his study, the creak of floorboards, the rustle of papers. She wondered if he ever slept, or if the nights were just another kind of endurance for him. She wondered if he'd ever let himself heal. The following week brought the first real snow. It fell softly at first, dusting the valley in white, then heavier, covering everything in a thick blanket that muffled sound and softened edges. The men worked to winterize the buildings, reinforcing walls and checking the livestock. Eliza prepared for the cold months ahead, organizing the root cellar, preserving what vegetables remained, planning meals that would stretch their supplies. One afternoon, while the men were out checking fence lines, Eliza ventured into the main barn. She needed to assess their stores of grain and hay to see what would need replenishing before the worst of winter set in. The barn was dim and quiet, smelling of animals and straw. She moved between the stalls, checking the bins, making mental notes. When she reached the ladder to the loft, she hesitated. The loft was where Sarah had died. Eliza looked up at the dark opening above, then set her jaw and began to climb. The loft was cleaner than she'd expected. The hay neatly stacked, the floor swept. Someone had been maintaining it. She walked carefully across the boards, checking the hay stores, when she noticed something in the corner. A trunk. Eliza moved closer. It was cedar, well made, with brass fittings that had tarnished to green. She shouldn't open it. She knew that. But her hands moved of their own accord, lifting the lid. Inside were women's things. A blue dress, carefully folded. A cameo brooch. A hair ribbon. Letters tied with string, and at the bottom, wrapped in cloth. A wedding photograph. Eliza lifted it carefully. The photograph showed a younger Caleb, his face unlined by grief, standing beside a woman with dark hair and strong features. She wasn't beautiful in the delicate way. She was beautiful in the way of mountains, of things built to last. Her hand rested on Caleb's arm, and even in the frozen moment of the photograph, Eliza could see the connection between them, the certainty. Sarah, what are you doing up here? Eliza spun around. Caleb stood at the top of the ladder, his face dark with anger. I was checking the hay stores, Eliza said, her heart pounding. I didn't mean... I shouldn't have opened it. I'm sorry. Caleb's eyes moved to the trunk, to the photograph in her hands. Something crossed his face, pain, fury, something she couldn't name. Get out, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Eliza carefully replaced the photograph and closed the trunk. She moved past Caleb toward the ladder, but his hand shot out and caught her arm. Don't ever touch her things again. His grip wasn't rough, but it was firm. Eliza met his eyes. I won't, she said. I'm sorry, I truly am. For a moment, something flickered in his gaze, recognition maybe of the sincerity in her voice. Then he released her and turned away. Eliza climbed down the ladder, her legs shaking. She walked back to the house, her face burning with shame and something else she couldn't quite identify. That night, Caleb didn't come to supper. The men ate quietly, their eyes darting between Eliza and the empty chair at the head of the table. No one asked where he was. They didn't need to. After the meal, Eliza cleaned up and retreated to her room. She lay on the cot, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment in the loft. The anger in Caleb's eyes, the way his hand had trembled when he'd grabbed her arm. She'd crossed a line she hadn't known existed. She wondered if he'd ask her to leave. Sleep came fitfully, broken by dreams of fire and photographs and a woman with dark hair calling for help that never came. When Eliza woke, pale light filtered through her window. She rose, washed, and went to the kitchen, expecting the usual silence of early morning. Instead, she found Caleb sitting at the table. He had the wedding photograph in his hands. Eliza froze in the doorway. Caleb didn't look up. Her name was Sarah Brennan before we married. She came west with a wagon train, got separated from her family in a river crossing. By the time she found her way to civilization, they'd moved on without her, thought she'd drowned. His thumb traced the edge of the photograph. She was 17 years old, alone in a territory she didn't know, and she didn't shed a single tear about it. Just found work, saved her money, and built a life. Eliza didn't speak, didn't move. I met her in a mercantile. She was arguing with the owner about the price of nails, refusing to be cheated just because she was a woman. I thought she was the most stubborn creature I'd ever seen. A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. Turned out I was right. He finally looked up, his eyes meeting Eliza's. She would have liked you, he said quietly, would have respected what you did during the fire, would have probably scolded me for freezing up like I did. Eliza took a careful step into the room. I really am sorry about the trunk. I know. Caleb set the photograph on the table. I keep her things up there because I can't bring myself to get rid of them, but I can't keep them in the house either. Every time I see them, He stopped, his jaw tightening. It's easier if I don't look. That's not living, Eliza said gently. That's just surviving. Caleb's eyes sharpened. And what would you know about it? More than you'd think. Eliza moved to the stove and began building the fire. I lost my husband to fever, lost our home, our future, everything we'd built together. For a long time, I was so angry at him for dying, for leaving me with debts I couldn't pay, for not being stronger. She paused, her hands still. But he didn't choose to die. He didn't choose to hurt me, and hating him for it only made the grief heavier. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. I don't hate Sarah. No, you hate yourself. The words hung in the air between them. Caleb stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Eliza thought he might leave, might retreat back into his silence. Instead, he walked to the window and stood there, his back to her. I should have saved her, he said, his voice rough. I was right there. I heard her calling, and I couldn't. His hands clenched into fists. I couldn't get to her. Eliza abandoned the fire and walked to him. She stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak but far enough to give him space. You tried, she said. That's all anyone can do. You tried, and the fire was stronger. That doesn't make you a failure. It makes you human. She died alone and terrified because I wasn't strong enough. She died knowing you loved her, Eliza countered, knowing you tried. Don't dishonor her memory by turning her death into your punishment. Caleb turned to face her, his eyes red-rimmed. How do I stop seeing it? How do I stop hearing her screaming? Eliza's throat tightened. I don't know, but I know you can't do it by locking yourself away, by pretending she never existed, by punishing everyone who tries to get close. I'm not. You are. She held his gaze. You're so afraid of losing someone else that you won't let anyone in. Not your men, not me, not anyone. And Sarah, she gestured toward the photograph on the table. Would she want this for you? Would she want you spending the rest of your life alone and frozen? Caleb's face crumpled. For a moment, Eliza thought he might break entirely. Then he sucked in a breath and steadied himself, the walls slamming back into place. Breakfast won't cook itself, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Eliza recognized the retreat for what it was. She nodded and returned to the stove. They didn't speak again that morning, but when the men came in for breakfast, Caleb was at the table and the photograph was gone. It was a small thing, but it was something. The days grew colder, the snow deeper. The ranch settled into winter's rhythm, feeding livestock, clearing paths, maintaining equipment, surviving. Eliza found her place in it, her role expanding beyond cooking and cleaning. She treated injuries, mended clothes, kept inventory of supplies. The men came to her with problems both practical and personal, and she listened, advised, helped where she could. She became, without quite meaning to, the heart of the household. Caleb noticed. She saw it in the way he watched her with the men, the slight softening of his expression when she laughed at one of Tommy's jokes or helped Miguel with his English. She saw it in the way he began to linger in the kitchen again, not speaking much but present, a silent companionship that felt more significant than words. One evening, while Eliza was rolling out pie dough, Caleb came in and sat at the table without preamble. Frank says you've been asking about expanding the root cellar, he said. Eliza glanced up, surprised. We'll need more storage if we want to keep enough food through late spring. The current space is barely adequate. What would you need? She wiped flour from her hands. More shelving, better ventilation to prevent rot, maybe reinforcement to keep the temperature stable. Caleb nodded slowly. I'll have the men start on it next week. Thank you. He didn't leave, just sat there, watching her work. It should have felt intrusive, but it didn't. There was something almost peaceful about it, the simple act of existing in the same space without tension. You've changed things here, Caleb said after a while. Eliza rolled the dough thinner. I'm just doing my job. No, it's more than that. He leaned back in his chair. The men are different, happier. They talk more, laugh more. Even Frank's been whistling, and I've known that man for 10 years and never heard him whistle once. Maybe they just needed someone to listen. Maybe. Caleb's eyes were steady on her face. Or maybe they needed someone who cared. Eliza's hands paused. You care about them. I pay them. I keep them safe. That's not the same thing. Isn't it? Caleb shook his head. Sarah used to say I confused responsibility with connection. She'd tell me that people need more than wages and a roof over their heads. They need to feel seen, valued. His mouth twisted. I never understood what she meant until she was gone. Eliza transferred the dough to a pie tin, pressing it carefully into place. She sounds like she was wise. She was. Caleb stood, restless energy moving through him. She was everything I wasn't, warm, open, trusting. She made this place feel alive. After she died, I let it become a machine, just work and routine and nothing else. You were protecting yourself. I was hiding. He turned to face her. You asked me in the loft if Sarah would want me spending my life alone and frozen. The answer is no. She'd be furious. She'd tell me I was wasting the life she didn't get to finish. Eliza met his eyes. Then why are you still doing it? Caleb was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because I don't know how to stop. Eliza set down her rolling pin and walked to him. She stopped close enough that he could have reached out and touched her if he'd wanted to. You start small, she said. You let yourself laugh at Tommy's jokes. You accept Frank's honey without deflecting. You sit in this kitchen and watch someone make pie without feeling guilty for it. She paused. You let yourself be human again, piece by piece, until one day you realize you're not just surviving anymore. You're living. Caleb's eyes searched her face, and Eliza saw something break open in them. Not breaking apart, but breaking through, like ice cracking to reveal running water beneath. Is that what you're doing? He asked. Learning to live again? I'm trying. Is it working? Eliza thought about the past weeks, about the rhythm of work and the quiet companionship of the men, and the way she'd started to feel something other than numbness when she woke each morning. Sometimes, she said honestly. Caleb nodded slowly. Then, so quietly she almost didn't hear it, he said, Maybe we can try together. Eliza's breath caught. Before she could respond, Tommy burst through the door, his face flushed with cold and excitement. Caleb, one of the mares is foaling. Frank says it's not going well. We need you. Caleb was already moving, grabbing his coat from the hook by the door. He paused long enough to glance back at Eliza. We'll talk later, he said. Then he was gone, Tommy on his heels, leaving Eliza alone in the kitchen with pie dough and a strange, fragile hope rising in her chest. She returned to her work, but her hands were steadier now, her mind clearer. Something had shifted in Caleb, and maybe in her too, something that felt like the first thaw after a long, brutal winter. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and relentless, covering everything in white. But inside, the fire burned warm, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Ironwood Ranch, Eliza allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she'd found more than a job. Maybe she'd found a place to heal. The mare's labored breathing filled the barn, a wet, desperate sound that made Eliza's stomach clench. She'd followed the men out after finishing the pie, unable to sit idle while something struggled for life just yards away. Now she stood in the doorway, watching Caleb kneel beside the horse, his hands gentle despite their size as he examined her. The mare was a chestnut beauty, her coat dark with sweat, her eyes rolling white with pain and fear. Frank stood at her head, murmuring soft words while Tommy and Miguel hovered nearby, their young faces tight with worry. The foal's positioned wrong, Caleb said, his voice tense. Breech. I need to turn it. Can you? Frank asked. I don't know. Caleb stripped off his coat, rolled up his sleeves. But if I don't try, we'll lose them both. Eliza watched as he worked, his movements careful and deliberate, despite the urgency thrumming through the barn. The mare whinnied, a high sound of distress, and tried to stand. Frank pressed his weight against her neck, keeping her down. Easy, girl. Easy now. Caleb's face was a mask of concentration, his jaw clenched so tight Eliza could see the muscle jumping beneath his beard. Minutes stretched like hours. The mare thrashed, her hooves striking the stall walls. Tommy jumped back to avoid being kicked. Almost, Caleb muttered. Almost. There. Something shifted. The mare's breathing changed, became more rhythmic. Caleb pulled back, his arms slicked to the elbows, and nodded to Frank. She's got it now. Let her work. They all stepped back, giving the mare space. She heaved herself partway up, her sides bellowing, and pushed. Once. Twice. On the third push, a tiny hoof emerged, then another, then a dark, wet head. The foal slid into the world in a rush of fluid and membrane, landing in the clean hay Eliza had spread earlier. For a terrible moment, it didn't move. Then it shuddered, sucked in air, and lifted its head. Tommy let out a whoop of relief. Miguel crossed himself, whispering something in Spanish. Frank grinned, the lines around his eyes deepening. Caleb sat back on his heels, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion and something that looked almost like wonder. The mare turned her head, snuffling at her newborn, and began to clean it with long, gentle strokes of her tongue. The foal, a filly, Eliza could see now, wobbled and struggled, trying to understand the mechanics of legs that seemed too long and too fragile to support anything. "She's perfect," Tommy breathed. Caleb stood slowly, wiping his hands on a rag Frank handed him. His eyes found Eliza across the barn, and something passed between them, an understanding maybe of the fragility of life and the triumph of refusing to give up on it. "Someone needs to stay with them tonight," Caleb said. "Make sure the filly nurses. Watch for complications." "I'll do it," Eliza heard herself say. All eyes turned to her. "You sure?" Frank asked. "It'll be cold out here and you need to watch close. First-time mothers can be unpredictable." "I'm sure." Eliza stepped into the barn properly, her gaze on the mare and her newborn. "I'll wake you if there's trouble." Caleb studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I'll bring you blankets and coffee." "Thank you." The men filed out, exhaustion written in every line of their bodies. Caleb was the last to leave, pausing at the door to look back at her. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "I know." Eliza settled onto a bale of hay, arranging her skirt around her. "But I want to." He held her gaze for a beat longer, then disappeared into the night. Eliza sat in the warm dimness of the barn, listening to the mare's gentle huffing and the filly's soft, exploratory sounds. The smell of hay and horse surrounded her, earthy and alive. She'd grown up around animals. Her father had kept a small farm before he died, but it had been years since she'd experienced this particular kind of peace. Caleb returned with an armful of wool blankets and a pot of coffee so strong she could smell it from across the barn. He set everything beside her, then surprised her by sitting down on the adjacent bale. "Thought you'd be asleep by now," Eliza said. "Too keyed up." He poured coffee into 2 tin cups, handed her one. "Birth is like that. Even when it goes well, the fear stays in your blood for a while." They sat in companionable silence, sipping coffee and watching the filly struggle to her feet. She fell twice, her spindly legs splaying out beneath her. On the third try, she managed to stay upright long enough to stumble toward her mother and find what she was looking for. "There we go," Caleb murmured, something soft in his voice. Eliza glanced at him. In the lantern light, the harsh lines of his face seemed gentler, the shadows less severe. He looked younger somehow, or maybe just less burdened. "You were good with her," she said. "The mare. You knew exactly what to do." "I've delivered enough foals over the years, doesn't mean it gets easier." He set his cup down. "Every time I think about all the things that could go wrong, all the ways I could fail. But you didn't fail tonight." "No." He looked at her. "Thanks to you being here." Eliza frowned. "I didn't do anything." "You spread the clean hay. You followed us out even though no one asked you to. You offered to stay when you could have gone back to the warm house." He paused. "You keep showing up when things are hard. That matters more than you know." Eliza felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the coffee. "I'm just doing what needs doing." "That's what Sarah used to say." Caleb's voice was thoughtful, not pained. She had this way of seeing what needed doing and just doing it, without fanfare or expectation of thanks, made her indispensable without ever demanding to be. "Is that why you married her?" A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. "I married her because she called me a stubborn jackass in front of the entire mercantile, and I realized I wanted to spend the rest of my life being called out by her." The smile faded. "I just didn't know how short that life would be." Eliza wrapped her hands around her cup, choosing her words carefully. "How long were you married?" 4 years, 5 months, 12 days. He said it without hesitation, the numbers clearly etched in his memory. "We were trying for a baby. She'd lost 2 before they quickened, was starting to think maybe it wasn't meant to be for us." The pain in his voice was old but not diminished. Eliza understood that kind of grief, the kind that didn't fade so much as learn to coexist with everything else. "I'm sorry," she said, because there was nothing else to say. Caleb nodded, his throat working. They sat in silence again, but it was different now, heavier with shared understanding, lighter for having been acknowledged. The filly nursed contentedly, her small tail flicking. The mare's eyes were half closed, her breathing deep and steady. Everything was as it should be. "You asked me earlier if I was learning to live again," Eliza said after a while. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Why did you let me stay?" "That first night you could have sent me away." 7 days was generous, but you didn't have to offer even that. Caleb considered the question, his gaze on the horses. "Honestly, I'm not sure. Part of it was practical. I did need someone who could cook, but there was something else." He looked at her. "You stood in my yard, exhausted and desperate and probably terrified, and you didn't beg. You didn't make promises you couldn't keep. You just asked for a chance to prove your worth. That kind of dignity in the face of nothing." He stopped, shook his head. "I recognized it. I'd had my own version of nothing after Sarah died, so maybe I saw something of myself in you. And now," Eliza asked quietly, "now I see someone who saved my ranch when I couldn't. Someone the men respect and actually smile around. Someone who makes this place feel less like a tomb." His voice dropped. "Someone who reminds me what it's like to want to be better." Eliza's breath caught. The air between them felt charged, full of things unspoken but deeply felt. "Caleb, I'm not saying it right." He stood abruptly, paced a few steps, then turned back. "What I mean is, you've given me something I didn't think I'd have again. Hope, maybe. Or just the possibility that life could be more than work and silence and waiting for nothing." Eliza rose too, setting her cup aside. "I don't know if I can be what you need. I'm not asking you to be anything but yourself." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "I'm just saying that having you here has mattered, to this ranch, to the men." He paused. "To me." The words hung between them like something precious and fragile. Eliza wanted to reach for them, to hold them close, but fear held her back. Fear that she'd misunderstood, that she'd invested meaning where there was only gratitude, that she'd ruin whatever this was by wanting too much. "I should check on them," she said instead, gesturing toward the horses. Caleb's face flickered with something, disappointment maybe, or understanding, but he nodded and stepped back. "I'll leave you to it. Wake me if you need anything." He left before she could respond, taking the warmth of his presence with him. Eliza sank back onto the hay bale, her heart racing. She told herself it was foolish to read into his words, to imagine that a man like Caleb Hart could want anything from her beyond competent housekeeping. But the way he'd looked at her, the things he'd said, they echoed in her mind long after his footsteps faded. The filly finished nursing and curled up against her mother's side, her eyes already closing. The mare nickered softly, content. Eliza pulled a blanket around her shoulders and settled in to watch over them, her thoughts too tangled to allow sleep. The night stretched long and quiet. Somewhere past midnight, the barn door creaked open and Frank appeared, 2 fresh cups of coffee in hand. "Thought you might need reinforcements," he said, sitting beside her. Eliza accepted the coffee gratefully. "Couldn't sleep?" "Old bones don't sleep well in winter." He nodded toward the horses. "How are they?" "Good, strong. The filly's already nursing well." "That's a good sign." Frank sipped his coffee, his weathered face thoughtful in the lamplight. Caleb came back to the bunkhouse looking like he'd seen a ghost. Good ghost, though, the kind that reminds you you're still alive. Eliza's cheeks warmed. "We were just talking." "Uh-huh." Frank's eyes were knowing. He hasn't talked, really talked, to anyone since Sarah died. Oh, he gives orders, discusses business, all that, but talking about things that matter, about feelings and hope and the future? He shook his head. "You're the first person he's let close enough for that." "I don't know if close is the right word. Closer than anyone else has gotten." Frank studied her. "Question is, do you want to get closer?" Eliza looked at him sharply. "That's presumptuous." "Maybe. But I've been around long enough to recognize when 2 people are circling each other, trying to figure out if it's safe to stop running." He set his cup down. "Eliza, I'm going to speak plain because life's too short for dancing around truth. Caleb's a good man who's been broken by grief. You're a good woman who's been broken by loss. Both of you are healing, slow and painful as that is. And from where I'm sitting, you're healing better together than either of you did alone. That doesn't mean anything except what you make of it, Frank interrupted gently. But I've seen the way he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching, and I've seen the way you look at him. So maybe instead of being afraid of what might go wrong, you could consider what might go right. Eliza was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, "What if I'm not strong enough? What if I let him down? What if he lets you down? What if the ranch fails? What if winter never ends?" Frank smiled. "Life's full of what ifs, girl. You can spend your time worrying about all of them, or you can take a chance on the ones that matter." He stood, joints creaking. "I'll leave you to think on it, but for what it's worth, I think you're stronger than you give yourself credit for. And I think Caleb sees that, even if you don't yet." Frank left, and Eliza sat alone with his words echoing in her mind. She watched the filly sleep, watched the mare's gentle breathing, and tried to sort through the tangle of her own feelings. She'd come to Ironwood Ranch with nothing, expecting nothing, hoping only to survive another week. But somewhere in the daily rhythm of work, and the quiet moments in the kitchen, and the way Caleb had started to soften around the edges, survival had transformed into something more. She'd started to want things again. A home, belonging, connection, and maybe, though it terrified her to even think it, love. The word felt too big, too dangerous. But she couldn't deny the flutter in her chest when Caleb looked at her, the warmth that spread through her when he smiled his rare, gentle smiles, the sense of rightness she felt working beside him. It was too soon, too fast, too risky. But maybe Frank was right. Maybe life was too short to spend hiding from what might be good. Dawn came slowly, the sky lightening from black to gray to pale gold. Eliza had dozed fitfully, waking every time the horses shifted. When Caleb appeared in the doorway with the sunrise behind him, she was awake and stiff and somehow more certain than she'd been in months. "How'd they do?" he asked, moving to check the mare in foal. "Perfect. She's a natural mother." Caleb ran a hand along the mare's neck, his touch gentle. The filly wobbled to her feet, curious about the visitor, and nosed at his hand. He laughed, an actual laugh, surprised and warm, and Eliza's heart squeezed. "She's bold," he said. "That's good." "Reminds me of someone." Eliza stood, folding the blankets, stubborn and brave and not afraid to demand what she needs. Caleb met her eyes, understanding the reference. "Sarah would have loved her." "Yes, I think she would have." They stood there in the quiet barn, the new day spreading light across the valley, and something shifted between them. Not a beginning exactly, but a deepening. An acknowledgement that whatever was growing here was real and worth tending. "I meant what I said last night," Caleb said quietly, "about you being here mattering." "I know." Eliza took a breath. "And I want you to know that being here matters to me too. This place, the work, She hesitated, then pushed forward. "The people. You. It all matters." Caleb's expression softened into something that looked almost like wonder. He took a step toward her, then stopped himself, as if unsure whether he had the right to close the distance. Eliza made the choice for both of them. She crossed the space between them and took his hand, rough and warm and solid, in hers. "I'm scared," she admitted, "of wanting too much, of losing again, of not being enough." "I'm scared too," Caleb said, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "But I'm more scared of letting fear decide everything for me, of waking up in another 3 years and realizing I wasted what time I had. So what do? We take it slow. We figure it out together." He squeezed her hand. "We let ourselves try." Eliza nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "Together." The word felt like a promise, fragile and fierce all at once. They stood there as the sun climbed higher, hands linked, the filly exploring her new world behind them. It wasn't a fairy tale ending or a grand romantic gesture. It was just two broken people choosing to be a little less broken together. And maybe that was enough to start. The days that followed were different in ways both subtle and profound. Caleb smiled more, the deep grooves around his mouth easing. He joined the men at meals instead of eating alone in his study. He asked Eliza's opinion on ranch matters and actually listened when she spoke. Small things, but they added up to something that felt like thawing. The men noticed. Tommy grinned every time he saw Caleb and Eliza in the same room. Frank's knowing looks became more frequent. Even Miguel and Garrett seemed lighter, as if the shift in Caleb's mood had lifted weight from all of them. Eliza found herself laughing more, the sound strange and welcome after so many months of silence. She caught herself humming while she worked, anticipating Caleb's evening visits to the kitchen with something dangerously close to excitement. They talked, really talked, about everything and nothing. Caleb told her about building the ranch from nothing, about the struggles and small victories that had shaped it. Eliza told him about her childhood on her father's farm, about Thomas and the life they'd tried to build together, about the long months of drifting after she lost everything. "You never talk about being angry," Caleb observed one evening. They were sitting on the porch despite the cold, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Eliza pulled her shawl tighter. At Thomas? At the creditors? At the world? At the unfairness of it all? She considered the question. "I was angry, furious sometimes, but anger takes energy, and I needed all my energy just to survive. So I let it go." "How?" "I told myself that carrying rage was like carrying hot coals. It burned me more than anyone else." She looked at him. "Besides, Thomas didn't mean to leave me in debt. He was just trying to build something better for us. His crime was hope, not cruelty." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I've been angry at Sarah," he finally said, "for going up into that loft when I told her not to, for dying and leaving me alone, for making me love her so much that losing her nearly destroyed me." "That's not anger," Eliza said gently. "That's grief pretending to be anger because grief is harder to face." He looked at her, something raw in his expression. "When did you get so wise?" "When I had nothing left but time to think." They sat in silence, shoulders almost touching, breathing the cold air and watching the world settle into darkness. Eliza felt something shift in her chest, a loosening, a lightness. For the first time in longer than she could remember, the future didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a possibility. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Frank came into the kitchen where Eliza was kneading bread dough, his face grim. "Tommy just rode back from town. There's talk about the Hendersons' ranch." Eliza paused, her hands still in the dough. The Hendersons were neighbors, their land bordering Ironwood to the east. What kind of talk? "Fire. Last night. Burned their barn to the ground. They lost most of their winter hay." Eliza's stomach dropped. "Was anyone hurt?" "No, thank heavens. But they're in trouble. Without hay, they can't feed their cattle through winter. They'll have to sell at a loss or watch them starve." Caleb appeared in the doorway, clearly having overheard. His face had gone pale, his jaw tight. "When did it happen?" he asked, his voice strained. "Around midnight, from what Tommy heard." Caleb turned and walked out without another word. Eliza saw him head toward the barn, his stride purposeful, but his shoulders rigid with tension. She wiped her hands clean and followed. She found him in the tack room, methodically checking every lantern, every oil can, every potential fire hazard with an intensity that bordered on frantic. "Caleb!" He didn't stop. "These need to be moved, farther from the hay, and we need more water barrels positioned around the property. If something happens, we need to be able to respond faster." "Caleb, look at me." He finally stopped, but his hands were shaking. "I can't let it happen again. I won't." Eliza crossed to him, took those shaking hands in hers. "We'll make the ranch safer. We'll do everything we can to prevent fire. But Caleb, you can't control everything. Sometimes accidents happen." "That's what everyone said about Sarah, that it was an accident, that I shouldn't blame myself." His voice cracked. "But she's still dead, and if I'd been more careful, if I'd checked the lanterns better, if I'd—" "Stop." Eliza squeezed his hands. "You're doing it again, taking responsibility for things beyond your control. Sarah's death was a tragedy, not a failure of yours. The Hendersons, well, will get help from you, from other neighbors, from the community. That's what people do. They help each other survive." Caleb pulled away, pacing the small space. I should ride over there. See what they need. We have extra hay. I can spare some. That's good. That's helpful. Eliza kept her voice calm, steady. But first, take a breath. Center yourself. You can't help anyone if you're drowning in panic. He stopped pacing and looked at her, something desperate in his eyes. How do you do it? How do you stay so calm when everything's falling apart? Because someone has to, she said simply. And because panic doesn't fix anything, action does. Caleb took a shuddering breath, then another. Slowly, the wildness in his eyes receded, replaced by grim determination. You're right. I'll take a wagon of hay over to them this afternoon. Frank can come with me. Good. And while you're gone, I'll work with the men to reorganize the barn like you wanted. More water barrels, better lantern placement, all of it. He stepped closer, raised a hand to her cheek. What would I do without you? You'd figure it out. You're stronger than you think. We're stronger together, he corrected, echoing the words they'd spoken days before. Eliza leaned into his touch, allowing herself this moment of connection before the work resumed. Yes, we are. Caleb left for the Hendersons' ranch that afternoon with Frank and a wagon loaded with hay. Eliza gathered the remaining men and explained what needed to be done. Tommy and Miguel moved the lanterns and oil stores to a separate shed away from the barns. Garrett positioned water barrels at strategic points around the property. Eliza swept the barns thoroughly, removing any debris that could catch fire, and double-checked every window and door for proper closure. By the time Caleb returned well after dark, the ranch had been transformed into something safer, more secure. He walked through with Eliza by lamplight, noting every change, and when they finished, he pulled her into an embrace that spoke of gratitude and relief and something deeper. Thank you, he murmured against her hair. You don't have to thank me. This is my home too now. She felt him still at those words, my home, and then he held her tighter. They stood there in the quiet barn, the smell of horses and hay around them, and Eliza realized with startling clarity that she meant what she'd said. Ironwood wasn't just a job anymore. It wasn't just a place to survive. It was home. And Caleb Hart, with all his grief and strength and slowly healing heart, had become someone she couldn't imagine leaving. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Winter deepened its hold on the valley, bringing snow that piled against the buildings and wind that howled through the mountain passes like something wild and hungry. The work became harder, every task requiring twice the effort in the cold. But inside the ranch house, something warm had taken root, something that grew stronger with each passing day despite the frozen world outside. Eliza woke one morning to find Caleb already in the kitchen, attempting to make coffee with the focused determination of a man tackling an unfamiliar task. The pot was smoking slightly, and the smell suggested he'd used far too many grounds. That's going to be strong enough to strip paint, she said from the doorway. He turned, caught in the act, and had the grace to look sheepish. I was trying to let you sleep a little longer. That's kind of you, but kindness doesn't make good coffee. She crossed to the stove and took over, dumping his attempt and starting fresh. Caleb watched her work with an expression she'd come to recognize, part admiration, part something softer that made her pulse quicken. Sarah used to tell me I couldn't make coffee to save my life, he said. She was right. It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife without pain shadowing his voice. Eliza glanced at him, noted the small smile playing at his mouth. She had good taste in complaints, Eliza said lightly. This would have been terrible. I know. He leaned against the table. But I wanted to do something for you. You're always taking care of everyone else. The words settled warm in her chest. Taking care of people is what I do. I know, but who takes care of you? Eliza's hands paused in their work. It was a question no one had asked her in longer than she could remember. Not since Thomas died, maybe not even before that. She'd been so busy being what everyone needed that she'd forgotten to consider what she needed herself. I manage, she said finally. Caleb moved closer, close enough that she could smell the cold still clinging to his clothes from his early morning check of the livestock. You shouldn't have to just manage. You should be... He stopped, searching for words. You should be cared for too, the way you care for others. Eliza turned to face him fully. Is that what you're trying to do? Care for me? I'm trying to learn how. His eyes were steady on hers. I'm out of practice with this, with letting someone matter. But you do matter, Eliza, more than I know how to say. Her breath caught. They'd been circling this for weeks now, this thing between them that was more than employer and employee, more than friendship, something undefined but increasingly impossible to ignore. Standing here in the early morning light with the coffee beginning to bubble and the rest of the world still asleep, it felt like they were the only two people in existence. You matter to me too, she said quietly. I think you have for a while now. Caleb reached out slowly, giving her time to step away if she wanted. When she didn't move, his hand cupped her cheek, his callous thumb brushing her skin with a gentleness that made her eyes sting. I don't want to rush you, he said. Don't want to push for something you're not ready for. But I need you to know that when I look at you, I see... He swallowed hard. I see a future I didn't think I'd have again, and that terrifies me and gives me hope in equal measure. Eliza leaned into his touch, her own hand coming up to cover his. I'm scared too, of wanting this and losing it, of not being enough, of all the ways it could go wrong. So we're both terrified. Seems like it. Maybe that means we're doing something right. A smile ghosted across his face. Maybe things worth having are supposed to be a little frightening. Before Eliza could respond, the sound of boots on the porch broke the moment. They stepped apart as Tommy burst through the door, his face flushed with cold and urgency. Caleb, we got a problem. The north fence is down. Looks like the weight of snow and ice finally took it out. Some of the cattle wandered through before we noticed. Caleb's expression shifted immediately to business. How many? Maybe 20 head. Miguel's tracking them now, but with this snow they could be anywhere. Caleb was already moving, grabbing his coat. He paused at the door, looking back at Eliza. Something passed between them, an acknowledgement that their conversation wasn't finished, just postponed. Be careful, she said. Always am. Then he was gone, Tommy on his heels, leaving Eliza alone with coffee that was now ready and a heart that was beating faster than it should. The men were gone all day, returning only as dusk painted the snow in shades of purple and gray. They'd found most of the cattle, but 3 were still missing, lost somewhere in the vast white expanse of the winter range. Caleb's face was grim as he stripped off his wet clothes in the mudroom, his hands red and raw from the cold. Eliza had hot stew waiting and coffee that would actually warm them from the inside. The men ate in grateful silence, too exhausted for conversation. When they finally trudged off to the bunkhouse, Caleb lingered in the kitchen, warming his hands around his coffee cup. We'll have to go back out tomorrow, he said. Can't leave them out there. They won't survive another night if the temperature drops like it's supposed to. You look half frozen yourself. Are you sure you should? I'm sure. His voice was firm but not harsh. I don't leave animals to die if I can help it. Eliza heard the unspoken weight in those words. Didn't leave animals to die. Didn't leave anyone to die if he could help it, except he had once, and it had broken something in him that was only now beginning to heal. She moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his shoulder. Then rest tonight. You'll need your strength. He turned to look at her, and the exhaustion in his face made him look older. Sometimes I wonder if I'm fighting a losing battle. Between the weather and the predators and the accidents, it feels like I'm just trying to hold back the tide with my bare hands. Maybe, but you keep trying anyway. That says something about who you are. Or it says I'm too stubborn to know when to quit. Those might be the same thing. She squeezed his shoulder. Get some sleep, Caleb. Tomorrow will come whether you're ready for it or not. He caught her hand before she could pull away, his fingers threading through hers. Stay for a minute, please. Eliza sat beside him at the table, their hands still linked. The fire in the stove crackled softly. Outside, wind rattled the windows. I've been thinking about what you said this morning, Caleb began, about being scared of wanting this and losing it. I understand that fear because I live with it every day. But Eliza, I've spent 3 years being so afraid of loss that I stopped living, stopped letting myself want anything beyond survival. He looked at their joined hands. And then you showed up with nothing but a cracked pot, and more courage than anyone I've ever met. And suddenly I wanted things again, wanted to hear you laugh, wanted to see you smile. Wanted to come home at the end of the day to someone who saw me as more than just the man who signs the wages. Eliza's throat tightened. Caleb, let me finish. His grip on her hand tightened. I don't know what the future holds. Don't know if I'll be good at this or if I'll mess it up completely. But I know I want to try. With you. If you'll have me. The question hung in the air between them, simple and profound. Eliza looked at this man who'd given her a chance when she had nothing, who'd shown her that broken things could still be strong, who was offering her his scarred and healing heart with an honesty that took her breath away. I'll have you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Scared and uncertain and all of it. I'll have you. Caleb's exhale was shaky with relief. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that felt like a promise. Then we'll figure it out together, he said. They sat like that for a long time, hands linked, finding comfort in the simple fact of each other's presence. When they finally parted for the night, Eliza lay in her small room and stared at the ceiling, her mind too full for sleep. She thought about all the roads that had led her here, the loss, the grief, the desperate walk to a ranch she'd never heard of. Thought about how the worst moments of her life had somehow guided her to this one, where a future she'd stopped believing in suddenly seemed possible again. Life was strange that way, cruel and kind in equal measure, breaking you down only to rebuild you into something stronger. She closed her eyes and let herself hope. The next morning brought brutal cold and skies the color of old bruises. Caleb and the men set out before dawn, bundled against the wind, determined to find the missing cattle. Eliza watched them go with a knot of worry in her stomach, then turned her attention to the work that needed doing. She was elbow-deep in laundry when she heard the horse approaching. Through the window, she saw a stranger dismounting, a tall man in a fine wool coat that marked him as someone from town, not a rancher. Something about the precise way he moved, the careful set of his shoulders, made Eliza's instincts prickle with unease. She dried her hands and opened the door before he could knock. "Can I help you?" The man removed his hat, revealing slicked-back hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good morning, ma'am. I'm looking for Caleb Hart. I'm told this is his property." "It is. He's out working. Can I take a message?" "I'd prefer to speak with him directly. When do you expect him back?" Eliza didn't like the way he looked past her into the house, cataloging everything he saw. "Hard to say. Could be hours." "Who should I tell him called?" "Thomas Bentley. I represent the Territorial Land Office." He produced a card from his pocket, held it out. "I have some questions about Mr. Hart's property deed." The unease crystallized into something sharper. "Questions about his deed? This land's been in Caleb's name for years." "Yes, well, there seem to be some irregularities that need addressing." Bentley's smile was all teeth now. "Survey markers that don't quite match the original filing. Boundary disputes with adjacent properties. These things happen, especially with older claims." "There's no dispute," Eliza said firmly. "Caleb's neighbors all know where his land ends and theirs begins. Nevertheless, the Territorial Office needs to verify the claim. I'll need to speak with Mr. Hart at his earliest convenience." Bentley tucked his card back into his pocket. "Perhaps you could have him come to my office in town. I'm staying at the Grand Hotel." "I'll tell him you stopped by." Bentley tipped his hat, climbed back on his horse, and rode away. Eliza watched him go, the knot in her stomach tightening. She'd dealt with men like that before, smooth-talking, official-sounding men who used legal words to hide predatory intentions. The creditors who'd taken everything from her had worn the same kind of expensive coats and false smiles. She went back inside, Bentley's card burning in her pocket like an accusation. Caleb and the men returned late that afternoon, half frozen and exhausted, but with all three missing cattle safely back with the herd. Eliza had hot food waiting, but she could barely focus on serving it. Her mind was on the conversation she needed to have with Caleb, on the potential threat that had showed up on his doorstep in a wool coat. When the men finally left and she and Caleb were alone, she pulled out Bentley's card. "Someone came by today, from the Territorial Land Office." Caleb took the card, his expression darkening as he read it. "What did he want?" "He said there are questions about your property deed. Irregularities with survey markers and boundaries." "That's ridiculous. My deed's clean." I bought this land fair and square, had it surveyed properly, filed all the right papers. I know, but Caleb, she hesitated. Men like that don't show up asking questions unless someone's paying them to. Someone wants your land. Caleb's jaw tightened. Who? I don't know, but I've seen this before. Men in nice clothes using legal language to intimidate people into selling or giving up claims they have every right to. She thought about Thomas, about the debts that had appeared from nowhere, about the way official-looking papers could destroy a life. You need to be careful. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, turning the card over in his hands. When he spoke, his voice was hard. I won't lose this land. I built this ranch from nothing. Sarah and I... He stopped, took a breath. This place is all I have left of her, of the life we made together. I'll fight for it. Then we'll fight for it together, Eliza said. But we need to be smart about it. Find out who's behind this and what they really want. Caleb looked at her, something fierce and grateful in his eyes. You don't have to involve yourself in this. It's my problem. We're past that now, aren't we? Your problems are my problems. She held his gaze. That's what together means. He pulled her close, his arms tight around her. Eliza leaned into him, offering what comfort she could. But even as she held him, her mind was racing with worry. She knew how these things went, knew how easily powerful men could twist the law to their advantage, how quickly a person could lose everything they'd worked for. She wouldn't let that happen to Caleb, not without a fight. The next few days were tense. Caleb rode into town to speak with his own lawyer, a gruff man named Hutchins who'd handled the original land purchase. He returned with grim news. According to Hutchins, there was indeed a challenge to Caleb's claim, filed by a mining company that claimed the survey markers had been misplaced and that a portion of Ironwood Ranch actually belonged to them. It's a lie, Caleb said, pacing the kitchen while Eliza listened. Those markers have been in the same place for 8 years. I check them myself every season. Can you prove it? I have the original survey documents, witnesses who know where the boundaries are. But Hutchins says that might not be enough if the company has money and influence on their side. What does this mining company want? Caleb stopped pacing, his face dark. There's copper in these mountains. Not much, but enough to be profitable if you know where to dig. The section they're claiming runs right through a ridge on the north edge of my property. He slammed his fist on the table. They want to tear up my land for ore, destroy pasture that took years to cultivate. Eliza felt cold fury settle in her chest. She'd seen this before too, powerful interests swallowing small operations, using the law as a weapon against people who couldn't afford to fight back. What are you going to do? Fight them. Take it to court if I have to. I won't just hand over my land to men who think money gives them the right to whatever they want. Court costs money, a lot of it. I know. Caleb's shoulders sagged. I have some saved. Might be enough. Might not. Eliza made a decision then, one she didn't fully think through but knew in her bones was right. I have money. Caleb looked at her sharply. What? Not much, but before everything fell apart, before the creditors came, I managed to hide a small amount. Sewed it into the lining of my coat. She'd never told anyone about that money, had kept it secret even from herself most days, a last desperate safety net. It's yours if you need it. Eliza, no, I can't. You can and you will if it comes to that. She moved to stand in front of him, her voice firm. This ranch is my home now. You said we'd fight for it together. That means all of it, Caleb. Everything I have is in this fight too. He stared at her, his eyes bright with emotion. You'd risk your last safety net for this place? For me? Yes. She said it without hesitation. Because home is worth fighting for. And you're... She paused, the words catching in her throat. You're worth fighting for. Caleb pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. When he finally pulled back, there were tears on his cheeks. I don't deserve you, he said roughly. Maybe not, but you have me anyway. They stood in the kitchen as winter light faded outside. Two people who'd lost everything once before, now holding tight to what they'd found together. The fight ahead would be hard, the outcome uncertain, but for the first time in years, neither of them was facing it alone. That had to count for something. The weeks that followed were a blur of preparation and worry. Caleb met with Hutchins repeatedly, gathering documents and evidence. Frank and the other men gave statements about the survey markers, confirming their positions. Eliza helped organize everything, her methodical mind finding patterns and discrepancies that Caleb, in his anger and fear, might have missed. But even as they worked, Eliza felt the strain building. Caleb grew quieter, more withdrawn. She'd catch him staring out windows with an expression that reminded her too much of the broken man she'd first met. The fear of losing the ranch was bringing back all his old ghosts, the helplessness, the rage at being unable to protect what was his. One night, she found him in the barn long after everyone else had gone to sleep. He was standing in the same spot where he'd frozen during the fire, staring at nothing. "Caleb." He didn't respond. Eliza walked to him, touched his arm. "Talk to me. I'm going to lose this place." His voice was flat, defeated. "They have money and lawyers and connections. I have some paper and the word of ranch hands. It won't be enough." "You don't know that." "I do." He turned to her, and the despair in his eyes made her chest ache. "This is how it always goes. Powerful people take what they want, and people like us just have to accept it." "No." Liza grabbed his shoulders, forced him to look at her. "No, that's fear talking. That's grief telling you that you're helpless." "But you're not, Caleb. You're strong and smart, and you have people who believe in you. What good does that do against men who can buy judges and forge documents?" "It does more than giving up does." She shook him slightly. "I know you're scared. I know this feels like losing Sarah all over again, losing something you love and being powerless to stop it. But this isn't the same. You're not alone this time. You have me. You have Frank and the men. You have people who will stand with you." "And if we lose anyway?" Eliza took his face in her hands, made him meet her eyes. "Then we lose. But we lose fighting, not cowering. We lose knowing we did everything we could. And then," her voice softened, "then we figure out what comes next. Together." Something broke in Caleb's expression. He pulled her close, his face buried in her hair, his body shaking with the force of emotions he'd kept locked down for too long. "I'm so tired of losing," he whispered. "I know, so am I." Eliza held him tight. "But we're not lost yet, and even if the worst happens, you won't face it alone. I promise you that." They stood like that for a long time, taking strength from each other, finding steadiness in shared fear. When they finally pulled apart, Caleb's eyes were clearer, the despair pushed back, if not entirely gone. "Thank you," he said, "for not letting me drown in this." "That's what love does," Eliza said, the words slipping out before she could stop it. Caleb went still. "Love?" Eliza's heart pounded, but she didn't take it back. "Yes, love. I love you, Caleb Hart. I love your strength and your stubbornness and the way you're trying so hard to be better than your grief. I love this ranch and the life we're building here, and I'm not going to let you give up on any of it." Caleb stared at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. Then he kissed her, deep and desperate and full of everything he couldn't say. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I think I have for a while now. I was just too scared to admit it." "Are you still scared?" "Terrified, but not enough to run from it." Eliza smiled through the tears on her cheeks. "Good, because I'm not going anywhere." They walked back to the house hand in hand, the winter night cold and clear above them. Whatever came next, court battles or victories, losses or gains, they'd face it together. And somehow, that made even the impossible seem survivable. In the kitchen, Caleb pulled her close one more time. "We're going to win this," he said, and for the first time he sounded like he believed it. "We're going to fight, and we're going to win." Eliza held him tight and hoped with everything in her that he was right. The morning of the hearing arrived with deceptive calm. Clear skies, weak sunlight, temperatures just above freezing. Caleb dressed in his only suit, a somber black thing he'd worn to Sarah's funeral and hadn't touched since. His hands shook as he fastened the buttons, and Eliza had to step in to fix his collar when he fumbled it twice. "You look like you're going to your own execution," she said gently, smoothing the fabric across his shoulders. "Feels like I might be." He caught her hands, held them against his chest. What if Hutchins is wrong? What if the judge sides with them? Then we deal with it. But Caleb, you have to walk in there believing you can win. If you go in defeated, you've already lost. He nodded, though the fear didn't leave his eyes. Eliza had dressed carefully too, in her best dress, the blue one she'd found in Sarah's trunk with Caleb's permission, altered to fit her smaller frame. She'd hesitated before accepting it, but Caleb had insisted, his voice gentle as he said Sarah would have wanted her things used, not left to gather dust. Frank drove them to town in the wagon, the journey silent except for the creak of wheels and the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves. Eliza sat close to Caleb, their shoulders touching, offering what comfort she could through simple proximity. She could feel the tension in him, coiled tight as a spring ready to snap. The courthouse was a squat brick building in the center of town, its windows reflecting the morning sun like watchful eyes. A small crowd had gathered on the steps, curious townspeople drawn by gossip, a few neighboring ranchers come to show support, and near the door Thomas Bentley in his fine wool coat, flanked by two other men in equally expensive suits. "That's them," Caleb said quietly. "The mining company lawyers." Eliza studied the three men. They had the sleek, well-fed look of people who'd never missed a meal or worried about losing their homes. Bentley caught her eye and smiled, the same cold expression he'd worn at the ranch. She looked away, her jaw tight. Inside, the courtroom smelled of old wood and lamp oil. The judge's bench dominated the front of the room, carved oak darkened with age. Wooden pews lined either side of a central aisle, already filling with spectators. Hutchins was waiting near the front, a stack of documents in his weathered hands. He nodded at Caleb, his lined face grave but not without hope. "We've got a solid case," he said as they approached. "Judge Morrison is fair, doesn't take kindly to companies trying to bully small landowners, but he's also a stickler for proper documentation. Everything has to be exactly right." "It is," Caleb said. "I know it is." "Then we'll be fine." Hutchins didn't sound entirely convinced. The bailiff called the court to order, and everyone rose as Judge Morrison entered. He was an older man, gray-haired and stern-faced, with eyes that missed nothing. He settled behind his bench, surveyed the room, and gestured for everyone to sit. "We're here regarding a land dispute," Morrison said, his voice carrying easily through the room. "The Consolidated Mining Company versus Caleb Hart, regarding property boundaries on what's currently designated as Ironwood Ranch. Mr. Bentley, you're representing the mining company?" Bentley stood smoothly. "I am, Your Honor, and we have compelling evidence that Mr. Hart's survey markers were improperly placed, resulting in him claiming land that rightfully belongs to our client." "That's a serious allegation. You have proof?" "We do." Bentley produced a sheaf of papers. "A new survey conducted by certified surveyors shows significant discrepancies between Mr. Hart's claim boundaries and the actual legal description in the original land grant." Morrison took the papers, studied them in silence. Eliza felt Caleb tense beside her, his hands gripping his knees hard enough that his knuckles went white. She placed her hand over his, a silent reminder that he wasn't alone. "Mr. Hutchins," Morrison said after a long moment, "what's your response?" Hutchins stood, his movements less polished than Bentley's but no less confident. "Your Honor, the survey Mr. Bentley references was conducted without Mr. Hart's knowledge or consent, on land he's owned and maintained for 8 years. We have the original survey documents, signed and certified, showing the exact placement of boundary markers. We also have sworn statements from multiple witnesses confirming those markers have not been moved or altered." "May I see your documents?" Hutchins handed over his own stack of papers. Morrison took his time reviewing them, his expression unreadable. The courtroom was so quiet Eliza could hear the clock on the wall ticking, each second stretching like taffy. Finally, Morrison looked up. "Mr. Bentley, your surveyors claim the markers are off by nearly a quarter mile. That's a substantial error. How do you explain Mr. Hart maintaining the wrong boundaries for 8 years without anyone noticing?" "The area in question is remote, Your Honor. The error went undetected until my client began exploring mineral rights in the region." "Convenient timing," Morrison said dryly. "Mr. Hart, stand up." Caleb rose, his face pale but composed. "How long have you owned this land?" 8 years, Your Honor. purchased it from the Territorial Land Office in 1869, had it surveyed by Edmund Wright, who was certified and recognized by the territory. And you've maintained the boundaries as surveyed since then? Yes, sir. I walk those markers myself every season. My neighbors know where my land ends and theirs begins. There's never been any dispute until now. Morrison nodded slowly. Mr. Bentley, who conducted this new survey for your client? Reynolds and Associates, a reputable firm out of Denver. A firm that's never set foot in this territory before, if I'm not mistaken. A firm that conveniently found an error no one else has noticed in nearly a decade. Morrison set the papers aside. I'm going to need more than conflicting surveys to overturn 8 years of established boundaries. Do you have anything else? Bentley's confident smile faltered slightly. Your Honor, the law is clear about proper land boundaries. If the survey shows an error, if the survey is legitimate, Morrison interrupted, which I'm not yet convinced of. Mr. Hutchins, you mentioned witnesses? Yes, Your Honor. We have statements from Mr. Hart's ranch hands, all of whom have worked the land and know the boundaries. We also have testimony from neighboring landowners confirming the marker positions. I'd like to hear from one of these neighbors. Hutchins gestured toward the back of the room. Frank Sullivan, if you'd come forward. Frank stood, moving to the front with the slow dignity of a man who'd seen enough of life not to be intimidated by courtrooms or lawyers. He was sworn in, his weathered hand steady on the Bible. Mr. Sullivan, Morrison said, how long have you known Mr. Hart? 10 years, Your Honor. Worked for him for 8 of those since he first broke ground on Ironwood Ranch. And you're familiar with his property boundaries? Yes, sir. I helped place some of those markers myself, under the surveyor's direction. I've walked that land more times than I can count. Those boundaries haven't moved an inch. Bentley stood quickly. Your Honor, Mr. Sullivan is employed by Mr. Hart. His testimony is biased. So is your surveyor's since they're employed by your client, Morrison said mildly. Continue, Mr. Sullivan. Have you ever had reason to question the boundary placements? Never. They match the survey documents exactly. And the neighboring ranchers, the Hendersons to the east, the McCalls to the south, they all acknowledge the same boundaries. There's never been confusion or conflict until this mining company showed up. Morrison made a note. Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. You may step down. He turned his attention back to Bentley. I'm still waiting for compelling evidence, Mr. Bentley. All I'm seeing is a new survey that contradicts an old one, conducted by a company that stands to profit if I rule in your client's favor. Bentley's jaw tightened. Your Honor, if you would just review the technical specifications. I have reviewed them, and what I see is a lot of numbers that could mean anything if manipulated correctly. Morrison leaned forward. Let me be clear, Mr. Bentley. I don't like companies that try to use the law as a weapon against hardworking people who've done everything right. If your client wanted that land, they should have bought it 8 years ago when it was available. They don't get to decide now that they want it and manufacture a dispute to steal it. Your Honor, that's not... I'm not finished. Morrison's voice hardened. Unless you have actual evidence of fraud or gross negligence in the original survey, and I mean real evidence, not just a conflicting opinion from hired surveyors, I'm inclined to uphold Mr. Hart's claim. Bentley glanced at his colleagues, some unspoken communication passing between them. Finally, he said, Your Honor, we'd like to request a continuance to gather additional evidence. Denied. This case has already disrupted Mr. Hart's operations and caused unnecessary stress. I'm ruling now. Morrison looked at Caleb. Mr. Hart, your original survey documents are in order. Your boundaries have been consistently maintained, and multiple witnesses confirm their placement. I see no reason to disturb your rightful ownership. He turned back to Bentley. The Consolidated Mining Company's challenge is dismissed. Mr. Hart retains full ownership of his land as originally surveyed. The crack of Morrison's gavel echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. For a moment, Eliza couldn't quite process what had happened. Then she felt Caleb's hand grip hers, felt him trembling with relief so profound it was almost like pain. Around them, the small crowd of ranchers erupted in quiet approval. Frank was grinning, his eyes bright. Hutchins allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Bentley and his colleagues gathered their papers in tight-lipped silence, their earlier confidence replaced by barely concealed anger. As they filed past, Bentley stopped beside Caleb. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Yes, it is." Caleb's voice was steady, stronger than Eliza had heard it in weeks. "You lost. The land is mine. And if you or your company come near my property again, I'll have you arrested for trespassing." Bentley's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing more. He turned and left, his colleagues following like well-dressed shadows. Morrison cleared his throat. "Mr. Hart, a word of advice. Get your boundaries professionally resurveyed and documented. File the updated paperwork with the territorial office. Make sure there's no room for future challenges." "I will, Your Honor. Thank you." Morrison nodded, then gestured for the bailiff to clear the court. Outside, the winter sunlight felt warmer than it had any right to be. Caleb stood on the courthouse steps, breathing like he'd just surfaced from deep water. Frank clapped him on the shoulder, and the other ranchers who'd come to support him offered congratulations and promises of help with the resurvey. Eliza stayed close, her hand in Caleb's, anchoring him as he processed the victory. When the well-wishers finally dispersed and they were left alone with Frank and Hutchins, Caleb turned to her. "We won," he said, like he couldn't quite believe it. "You won," Eliza corrected, "because you didn't give up, because you had the courage to fight." "We won," Caleb insisted. "I couldn't have done this without you, without knowing you were beside me, believing in me even when I didn't believe in myself." Hutchins cleared his throat. "I hate to interrupt, but there's the matter of my fee." Caleb reached for his pocket, but Eliza was faster. She pulled out the small leather pouch she'd sewn into her coat lining months ago, the last of her hidden money, saved for emergencies she'd hoped would never come. "This should cover it," she said, handing it to Hutchins. The lawyer hefted it, nodded. "That'll do fine." He tipped his hat. "Congratulations, Mr. Hart. You've got good land and better luck. Don't waste either." He left, and Frank diplomatically announced he'd get the wagon ready, giving Caleb and Eliza a moment of privacy on the courthouse steps. "You didn't have to do that," Caleb said, looking at where the pouch had been. "That was your last safety net. I told you weeks ago everything I have is in this fight." Eliza smiled up at him. "Besides, I don't need a safety net anymore. I have something better." "What's that?" "A home, a partner, a future." She touched his face, feeling the tension finally draining from him. "I have you." Caleb pulled her close, right there on the courthouse steps with half the town watching, and kissed her with a passion that made her heart race and her cheeks flush. When they broke apart, he was smiling, truly smiling, with a lightness she'd never seen in him before. "Marry me," he said. Eliza blinked. "What?" "Marry me, Eliza Rowe. Not because you work for me or because you saved my ranch or because I owe you anything. Marry me because I love you and I want to spend whatever time we have building a life together. A real life, not just survival." Eliza's eyes filled with tears. "That's the worst proposal I've ever heard. It's the only one I know how to give." She laughed through the tears, joy bubbling up from somewhere deep inside. "Then yes, yes, I'll marry you, you stubborn, broken, beautiful man." Caleb kissed her again, and this time when they broke apart, there were tears on his face too. The ride back to the ranch felt different, lighter, full of possibility instead of dread. Frank drove with a knowing smile, tactfully ignoring the way Caleb and Eliza sat pressed close together, hands linked, talking quietly about the future. "We'll need to plan a wedding," Eliza said. "Something simple. I don't need anything fancy. We can have it at the ranch. Frank can stand as my witness." "I'd like that." She paused. "What about Sarah's things? The trunk in the loft?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I think it's time to go through them properly. Keep what matters. Let go of what doesn't. Maybe donate some to families in need." He looked at her. Sarah would have liked that. She was always giving things away, said possessions mattered less than people. "She sounds like she was wise." She was, and I think she'd be glad I found someone else who understands that. He squeezed her hand. "I'll always love her. That doesn't change." "I know, and I wouldn't want it to. She was part of making you who you are. I'm grateful for that." When they arrived at the ranch, the men came out to hear the news. Tommy whooped and spun in a circle when Caleb announced the victory, while Miguel crossed himself and murmured thanks. Garrett, usually silent, actually smiled. "Drinks are on me tonight. Frank announced. "We're celebrating proper." But first there was work to be done. The livestock needed tending. The buildings needed checking. The daily rhythm of the ranch needed maintaining. They all scattered to their tasks, energy renewed by the good news. Eliza went to the kitchen to start supper, but Caleb followed her inside instead of heading out with the men. "There's something I want to show you," he said. He led her upstairs to his bedroom, a space she'd cleaned but never truly entered when he was present. It was spare and neat, the bed made with military precision, the few personal items arranged with care. Caleb went to the dresser and opened the top drawer, pulling out a small wooden box. Inside was a ring. "It was my mother's," Caleb said quietly. "She gave it to me before she died, told me to give it to someone who deserved it. I gave it to Sarah, and she wore it for 4 years. After she died, I put it away because I couldn't stand to look at it." He lifted the ring from the box, a simple gold band with a small garnet set in the center. "But I think it's time it served its purpose again." He took Eliza's hand and slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, the garnet catching the light like a drop of dark wine. "It's beautiful," Eliza whispered. "You're beautiful." Caleb brought her hand to his lips. "And you're mine, if you'll have me." "I already said yes, remember?" "I know, but I wanted to say it proper, with a ring and everything." He pulled her close. "I want to do this right, Eliza. Want to give you the life you deserve." "You already have. You gave me a chance when no one else would. You gave me a home. You gave me yourself, even when you were terrified to do it." She looked up at him. "That's more than I ever thought I'd have again." They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the quiet bedroom, the ring heavy and right on Eliza's finger. Through the window, she could see the valley spreading out below, the land Caleb had fought for, the home they'd defended together. "We should tell the men about the wedding," Eliza said eventually. "They'll want to help prepare. They'll probably want to throw some kind of celebration." "Let them. They deserve to celebrate too. They stood by you when they didn't have to." Caleb nodded, his arms still around her. "Everything's changing so fast. A few months ago I was alone and half dead inside. Now I have you, and the ranch is safe, and the future actually feels possible." Change can be good, even when it's terrifying. "Is it terrifying for you?" Eliza considered the question honestly. "Sometimes. I keep waiting for something to go wrong, for this to be taken away like everything else was. But then I remember that fear only wins if I let it, and I'm tired of being afraid." "So am I." They went downstairs together, and when they told the men about the engagement, the response was exactly what Eliza had expected. Tommy's enthusiastic congratulations, Frank's knowing grin, Miguel's shy smile, Garrett's firm handshake. The evening meal turned into an impromptu celebration, with Frank producing a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving and Tommy insisting on making a toast that was more enthusiasm than eloquence. "To Caleb and Eliza," he said, raising his glass. "Two people who deserve every happiness and a future that's brighter than the past ever was." They all drank to that, the whiskey burning warm down Eliza's throat. She looked around the table at these men who'd become her family, at the home she'd found in the least likely place, at Caleb beside her with his hand covering hers. This was what she'd lost when Thomas died and the creditors came. Not just a house or possessions, but this sense of belonging, of being part of something larger than herself, of mattering to people who mattered to her. She'd thought that kind of life was gone forever. But here it was again, different than before but no less real. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, on a crisp February morning when the sun made the snow-covered valley sparkle like diamonds. They kept it simple, as planned. Just the ranch hands, a few neighbors, and the minister from town who'd known Sarah and seemed pleased that Caleb was moving forward with his life. Eliza wore the blue dress again with Sarah's cameo pinned at her throat, another gift from Caleb, given with the words, "She'd want you to have it." Her hair was pinned up, and Frank's wife had woven small winter flowers into the arrangement, white and delicate against the dark strands. Caleb wore his suit again, but this time it didn't look like funeral clothes. It looked like what it was, a man dressing up for the most important day of his life. They stood in the ranch house parlor with the fire crackling behind them and everyone they cared about gathered close. The minister spoke about commitment and partnership, about building a life together through joy and hardship, about the covenant of marriage being a choice renewed every day. When it came time for vows, Caleb took both of Eliza's hands in his. "I don't have fancy words," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "But I promise you this. I will work every day to be worthy of the second chance you've given me. I will protect this home we've built and the life we're making. I will love you with everything I have for as long as I have it to give, and I will never take for granted the gift of your presence beside me." Eliza's throat was tight with tears, but she managed to speak. "I promise to stand with you through whatever comes, to be your partner in work and in life, to remind you of your strength when you forget it, and to let you remind me of mine. I promise to make this house a home, to fill it with laughter and warmth, and to love you not despite your scars, but because of everything they've taught you." The minister smiled. "Then, by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. Caleb, you may kiss your bride." Caleb did, gentle and reverent, like she was something precious he was afraid to break. When they pulled apart, the room erupted in applause and cheers. Tommy was grinning so wide his face might split, Frank was wiping suspiciously at his eyes, and even Garrett was clapping enthusiastically. The celebration that followed was warm and genuine. They ate the feast Eliza had prepared, with help from the neighboring women: roasted chicken, fresh bread, vegetables from the root cellar, and a cake that was slightly lopsided but tasted perfect. There was music, with one of the neighbors producing a fiddle and playing reels that got everyone on their feet. Caleb danced with Eliza, his movements awkward but earnest, and she didn't care that he stepped on her toes twice because his smile was worth every clumsy moment. They danced until the sun set and the stars came out, until the guests finally headed home and the ranch hands retreated to the bunkhouse, leaving the newlyweds alone in the house that was now truly theirs. In their bedroom, no longer just Caleb's but theirs, they helped each other undress with a tenderness that spoke of new beginnings and old wounds finally allowed to heal. When they came together, it was with a reverence that honored both the past and the future, both the grief they'd carried and the joy they'd found. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, Caleb's hand tracing idle patterns on Eliza's shoulder. "I never thought I'd have this again," he said quietly. "A wife, a partner, someone to share the weight of everything with. Neither did I. I thought I was done with love, with building a life with someone." "Are you glad you were wrong?" Eliza smiled against his chest. "More than I can say." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, the winter wind howling outside but unable to touch the warmth they'd created within. Spring came slowly that year, the snow melting in reluctant patches to reveal the brown earth beneath. But when it finally arrived in earnest, it brought with it a sense of renewal that felt almost prophetic. The valley turned green, wildflowers bloomed in impossible colors, and the cattle that had survived the winter grew fat on new grass. Eliza watched it all from the porch of the house that was now undeniably her home, one hand resting on the slight swell of her belly where new life was just beginning to make itself known. Caleb had wept when she'd told him, tears of joy and terror mixed together, and they'd spent the night talking about the future, about the child who would grow up knowing both their parents, about the legacy they'd build together. The ranch thrived under their joint stewardship. The boundaries had been resurveyed and properly documented, every marker confirmed and certified beyond any future dispute. The mining company had tried one more time to make an offer on the land, but Caleb had refused with a firmness that left no room for negotiation. Ironwood Ranch was not for sale, not now, not ever. One evening in late spring, Caleb took Eliza up to the barn loft. The trunk was gone now, its contents sorted and distributed as they'd planned. In its place was a new marker, a simple wooden plaque with Sarah's name and dates carved carefully into the surface. "I wanted her to be remembered," Caleb said, "not hidden away but acknowledged. She was part of this place, part of me. Our child should know about her." "That's good," Eliza said, touching the plaque gently. "She deserves to be remembered, and our child will know about the woman who helped build this ranch, who made it a home before I ever arrived." Caleb put his arm around her, and they stood together looking out over the valley as the sun set in shades of gold and rose. "Do you think she'd approve?" Caleb asked. "Of us? Of everything that's happened?" "I think she'd be glad you're living again, instead of just surviving. I think she'd want you to be happy. I am happy, happier than I have any right to be after everything. You have every right to be happy. We both do. We've earned it through all the grief and loss and fighting. Caleb pulled her closer. Thank you for being stubborn enough not to give up on me. Thank you for being brave enough to let me in. They stood there until the stars came out, two people who'd lost everything and found each other in the aftermath. Two people who'd learned that the worst moments of life could somehow, impossibly, lead to the best ones. That endings and beginnings were sometimes the same thing, viewed from different angles. That home wasn't a place you found. It was something you built, piece by piece, with the people brave enough to stay. Below them, the ranch settled into the quiet rhythms of evening. Lantern light flickered in the bunkhouse. The horses nickered softly in their stalls. The land stretched out in all directions, safe and secure and theirs. And in the house where Eliza had once been just a hired cook, where Caleb had been a broken man frozen by grief, warmth glowed from every window. A fire burned in the hearth. A meal waited on the table. A life, real and full and earned, waited to be lived. They'd both come from nothing. They'd both been stripped down to their bare essentials, forced to discover what they were made of when everything else was taken away. And what they discovered was this: that strength wasn't about never falling, but about getting back up. That love wasn't about avoiding loss, but about choosing connection despite the risk. That a home could be rebuilt even from ashes, as long as you had the courage to start again. Eliza looked at the ring on her finger, garnet and gold, worn by two women now, a symbol of continuity and change both. She thought about the woman who'd worn it first, about the legacy Sarah had left behind, and she thought about the child growing inside her, who would carry both their stories forward into whatever future waited. We should head back, Caleb said eventually. Getting cold up here. In a minute. Eliza wanted to hold on to this moment a little longer, this perfect, fragile instant where everything felt right and whole and possible. Caleb seemed to understand. He held her as the darkness deepened and the temperature dropped, held her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. And maybe she was. Maybe they both were. Two people who'd survived the unsurvivable, who'd found each other against all odds, who'd built something real and lasting from the broken pieces of their pasts. When they finally walked back to the house hand in hand, the valley was quiet around them. But inside, the fire burned warm. The coffee was hot. The future stretched out like an open road, full of possibility and promise. They'd both arrived at Ironwood Ranch with nothing. Caleb with his grief, Eliza with her cracked pot and desperate hope. They'd both been tested by fire and loss and the cruelty of circumstance, but they'd survived. More than that, they'd found their way to something better than survival. They'd found home. They'd found love. They'd found the strength to begin again. And in the end, that was worth more than all the gold in the mountains, more than any land or title or possession, worth everything, in fact, worth fighting for, worth holding on to, worth building a life around. Together.